Great. All right, so good morning, everyone. Would like to call to order a meeting of the Board of Education Finance Committee. And we will hand it off to Mr. Rudel for a review of fiscal year 2021 year-end financial report.
So the year-end financial report reflects year-end expenditures of $102,913,878. This does leave a year-end positive balance of $1,370,630. We were within 0.11% of the May expenditure forecast of $103 million, or $110,971 greater than the May forecasted balance. The main changes from the May forecast at the end of the year, special education did have some additional unencumbered transportation expenditures that added to the savings of about $56,000. Athletic transportation and sports officials, an additional $33,000. District legal fees continued to trend under budget by about $17,000. We had some small salary savings of about $12,000 across all the categories, primarily in substitutes and part-time costs. Special education legal fees, consultant services, and contracted services for $6,500. Police and fire, mostly at the high school, for about $4,000. Health insurance by about $3,650. Revenue for Medicaid, ELP tuition, and field rentals was about $2,600 lower. Tuition reimbursement, we did have one straggler tuition reimbursement that came in and was approved for $4,000. Regular transportation was about $4,000 less than forecast. Out of district tuition, $5,700. All the supplies, materials, travel, property services across all the RCs, a cumulative $6,600 less. Payroll taxes about $7,400, and then utilities about $7,700. And then in the COVID accounts, the main changes really were contact tracing. If you recall, I think it was back in April, we did have a transfer that was approved to put funds aside in case it was needed. Those funds really weren't needed, so that went to the balance. Some savings in the LPNs, substitutes, bus cleaning, and then small amounts in custodial overtime and contracted cleaning. Overall, the general education's RCs ended up with a positive $493,532. Special education RCs were $775,867. The two really that added to that were the additional money in excess costs, and then special education transportation. And then the reopening expenditures ended up at $101,000 to the positive, and that was primarily LPNs and the cancellation of the weekend cleaning. We did include a graph of really where those savings went. It's really 5 buckets that make up the majority of that 1.3 million. It's the additional excess cost revenue that we received due to a higher reimbursement rate. Some salary savings, which are primarily due to 2 administrators that left that weren't filled at the end of the year. Transportation savings, including athletic transportation, special education transportation, and then regular home to school transportation, legal fees, and then the COVID accounts that I mentioned earlier. All those make up about 79% of the 1.3 million, or just shy of 1.1. So just to go through some of the RCs, the only real main change at the high school is substitutes ended with about 319 to the positive. And then all those operating accounts, textbooks, materials, periodicals, other student activities ended up with 485. Fitch ended up with $12 in savings in teaching and supplies. Local travel was also under budget. RC3, the middle school, the main change is those small operating accounts, so classroom reference, periodicals, media consumables, and PD 151 under budget. Henley, RC5, again, those smaller accounts, textbooks, classroom reference, professional development, $480 in savings. And then police fire ended with 52. Homes, again, some of those smaller accounts ended up with $208 in savings. Oxbridge, the only real change is a small balance in substitutes for $95. And then again, those small accounts, textbooks, periodicals, professional development for $389. Royal, the only real change was those small accounts again, textbooks, classroom reference, periodicals, and professional development for $646. Tokenique, the only really main change again are those small accounts for about $80. In RC11, athletic training services ended with a positive balance of 200, which was new. And then some of those smaller accounts like teaching supplies and consultants, 151. The biggest account was athletic transportation, savings of 30,470. There were less sub-varsity games and thus less transportation costs. Same with interscholastic officials, a positive 2,796. In RC12, overtime ended up with a positive balance of 534. Part-time help ended up with a positive 4,400. Electrical materials, small balance of $24. RC 13, again, some of those smaller accounts, a positive 85, and then local travel due to less itinerant travel, 1,223. Art, some of those smaller accounts was new, so a total of $17 between software, periodicals, and professional development. And RC 15, technology, local travel, ended the year a little bit under by about $316. RC 16, as we referenced earlier, legal fees did end the year with $96,000 savings compared to budget. The second half of the year did trend significantly lower than budget. RC 17, some of those smaller accounts like health supplies, travel, professional development, $506. RC 18, tuition reimbursement, as I mentioned earlier, we did have a late tuition reimbursement that was received and approved, and that brought that balance down to $4,715. Curriculum, local travel ended the year again with savings of $3,983. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, the program coordinators, which were vacated early in the second half of the year, were not filled due to the restructuring in the curriculum office, and that saved about $94,000. No real changes in RC 20. RC 21, some of those smaller accounts, again, sessions, periodicals, resource materials, $217 in savings. RC 23, no real changes. Consultant services did end the year with $1,500. We did receive a grant, small grant from state reimbursement for the adult ed program that we contract with the Stanford Public Schools, and that was only $74, but that was a small change. And then in RC 24, substitutes did end positive by about $3,800. Transportation, the driver position did end with a favorable balance of $1,800, which was a slight reduction as we did need a sub driver to cover for an employee. Legal fees did trend a little bit lower than expected at $53,000 in savings. Some of those smaller accounts, teaching supplies, testing, local travel, dues and fees, savings of about $5,000. In-district and out-of-district transportation did accumulate savings of about $235,000. The biggest being out-of-district transportation, which was about positive $200,000. Tuition, public and private, were both positive, pretty close to the previous forecast by $42,000 and $14,000 respectively. And then we did receive all of our excess cost reimbursement. In total, we received just shy of $2.7 million, which was $374,000 above budget, which does reflect a reimbursement rate of just over 80%. In RC 25 fixed, transportation did end of the year favorable by about $28,000. Water was a positive $6,500. Electricity by about $5,300. Telephone costs by about $5,900. The sewer did end the year positive $12,000. And then some small savings in current accounts such as property insurance and workers' comp. FICA expenses did end the year with a negative balance of $7,434. No real change in RC 26, which is ELP. And then closing out the RCs, RC 28, we did end the year with a slight positive balance in substitutes as there was less quarantining towards the end of the year. Launch monitors were pretty much right where we expected. LPNs was slightly higher at 41,798. We did have two resignations, one that we referenced at the last finance committee, and then another one that happened quite towards the end of the year, which added to that 41,000. Transportation cleaning ended favorable balance of 1,170. And then contracted cleaning, we did end that the week of the 22nd of May, and that did end the year with 32,544 to the positive. So in total, $1.3 million is the overall return to the town, and then there are no transfers to end the year.
Committee questions. Mrs. Ritchie.
All right, my questions are really focused on the accounting adjustments. There's just a couple that I was hoping you could walk us through that popped out to me, including the expense for Board of Ed meeting recording. If we could just have an overview of what those expenses are. And the other thing that popped out to me was evaluations, hearing services, auditory services. So if we could just have a brief overview of what those are and what they, if there's an impact going forward to our expenses.
So other board expenses is typically the cost of recording meetings, both committee meetings and the actual Board of Ed meetings, so they were slightly higher. There were a couple of board members who also took some classes through CABE. Those were smaller amounts, but those also go into the account. In terms of the special ed accounts, whether it's pupil evaluations, there was a little bit of a spike in pupil evaluations towards the end of the year, though it was offset by less legal fees. And then some adjustments between contracted PT and speech that the special education department needed. In terms of carrying forward to the next year, things do look relatively good as of right now. We were awarded another grant in the total of $199,000. It's an IDEA ARP grant. It does have to be used for special education recovery services. The state has not indicated how many years that grant is for yet, but since it's tied to IDEA, our expectation is it's probably a 2-year grant, which is what IDEA is. But overall, nothing that's really impacting the lead into the next fiscal year.
Another, out of curiosity, there's something there about asbestos training. Is that training our staff to
Yes.
remediate?
Yep, so it's
Okay.
training all the custodians and maintenance people to probably be aware of how to treat asbestos, what are the protocols you have to do if you actually see asbestos, things like that.
So I just, again, I want to highlight that we got 100% of our excess cost reimbursement. I haven't seen that in about 15 years. So while it's fabulous and I would love to see 100% reimbursement going forward, I think we would have to live that to believe that. And I think that's made a significant impact on having money to return to the town, which we're happy to do. But that 100% reimbursement rate has not been seen in quite some time. So I'm glad we have it. I'd love to see it ongoing, as that was what the algorithm was made to do. But, you know, we always kind of fight around, are we 68%, are we 71%? So it should be highlighted that we are 100%. My other question would be, or just asking you to highlight, I see a lot about substitutes being under, but we've now broken substitutes out into so many lines that, can you just clarify for people this substitute line versus long-term substitutes versus building substitutes?
So these are primarily your daily substitutes. So they're the individuals who get $100 a day. You typically see them maybe for a day or two, and then the teacher comes back. It could be a sick day, or it could be like a personal day for the teacher. The building subs are in the schools 4 days a week. They're more regular, same face typically throughout the year. They do typically turn over about midway through the year. And then long-term substitutes are individuals who are covering for leave of absences, whether it's a maternity leave, a leave of absence that was granted due to a medical issue, things like that.
Okay, and so where did we end up on long-term subs? Could you just talk about that a little bit?
So long-term subs were approximately $900,000. It was a few $1,000s under the revised budget, but well over the original budget. Whenever you have a lot of long-term leave of absences that are unpaid, typically what you'll see is the long-term sub account will be much higher, but then you have salary savings across the RCs for the teachers who aren't getting paid. And so throughout the year, there were adjustments made that took those salary savings, whether it was from classroom teachers, special education teachers, itinerant teachers, whatever those might be, those go into the long-term sub account. So while you have upward pressure in the long-term sub account, you have downward pressure in the salary account.
And did you find that balance this year? Because that typically happens when teachers leave, but were you able to find
It was
that balance
relatively
this year?
close. I mean, you do
Okay.
have some instances where the teacher on leave is getting paid still, and that's why you do have a budget of 475, because you're carrying those expenses twice. But for the most part, that spike that kind of doubled the original budget was really pretty close to a wash in terms of salary savings versus long-term subs costs.
Mr. Sini, any questions?
Yeah, well, just a couple comments. One, definitely happy to see this budget year behind us. It started with a reduction, and then COVID hit as well. So, when I think of basically the surplus or deficit, we can't forget the 1.788 special appropriation from the Board of Finance. So, Rich, I just wanted to confirm, if I net out the 1.371 million from that special appropriation, we're looking at basically a adjusted deficit of about 420,000.
That's correct.
Okay. And then what was interesting from an analytical point of view, and I just want to make sure I'm thinking about this correctly. If I look at the reopening expenses, RC 28, it's about 2.5 million. If I net out that special appropriation of, close to 1.8 million, I get to 700,000, again, kind of a net deficit from just taking the reopening expenses from that RC, from that special appropriation. But, based on what you just told me, it's interesting that non-COVID expenses throughout this whole, ordeal, if you will, in that budget year, actually supplied a surplus of about 300,000. And I just want to make sure if that makes sense, or I should take this offline with you, but I just found it really interesting, how this year ended up playing out on a net basis, net of the appropriation.
Yep. I mean, if we look at non-COVID expenditure savings, some of the bigger ones in terms of that 300,000, about a third of that was the savings from the 2 administrators that left the district in the curriculum office. And then probably another third of that were legal fees that trended under both for special education and the district overall. So really 2/3 of that non-COVID savings could really be attributed to those 2 accounts. And then we had obviously the excess cost reimbursement that was much larger than anticipated and likely won't materialize again this year as much as we'd like it to. But really those 2 areas in the non-COVID areas are really what attributed to that surplus. And then obviously we had surplus accounts that were due to COVID, such as transportation, and then some individual supplies and long-term leave of absences, things like that. Transportation was obviously the biggest savings that materialized due to COVID.
All right, thanks, Rich. And I guess the question tied to Mrs. Ockman's comment about excess cost. I mean, we did not budget for 100% reimbursement for the next fiscal year, correct?
Correct, 75%.
And then my last question, I don't know if you were going to go forward and talk about the grant financial report at all, or should I hold off on that question?
No, you can ask. It's in the packet.
I saw about 24,000 in carryovers. Maybe if you could just call them out and talk about that, whether or not they were budgeted for fiscal year 22.
So the biggest carryover is the IDA grant. So the IDA grant is a 2-year grant. It is a grant that really just houses staffing for special education, primarily special education paras. Typically what you see in grants like this is what's called compression. The grant typically stays relatively flat, and obviously salaries increase for the staff that's in there. So typically you always want to see a little bit of carryover in there. Otherwise what you're going to end up having is a shift of those services into your operating budget. Another one is the title grants. Title grants typically also have a little bit of carryover. Some of it has to do with professional development, and there's also an instructional specialist that's coded in one of the title grants. And so that carryover, again, has to deal with the compression that you would see in the IDEA. Those are your main carryovers, and it is typical that you would see those carryovers from year to year. You wouldn't necessarily want to spend 100% of the IDEA grant in 1 year or the title grants in 1 year.
And then did you budget for any carryovers? For the
we do budget for carryover in IDEA grant and the title grants.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
No, just so we're clear for on Tuesday, we'll approve the monies that will be returning to the town. Is that correct, on Tuesday night?
Yes.
Okay.
So I could certainly ask the board as to their the pleasure in doing how they would like to do that. If you don't do a motion to return to the town, it automatically will go back anyway. But it may be good practice here to do a
So we
motion on
move
that.
each year to return the money to the town. We have a memo presented to us, just so everyone is
Yeah.
aware of the financial situation. I think we are well aware that it'll go back to the town kind of anyway, but we want to make sure all board members are aware of
Yeah,
and
and then-
agree with the decision and the amount. Yeah, and
Yep.
it's slightly earlier than we typically do this, so we're sure, and I'm sure it's been a busy summer, but we've encapsulated everything through the end of that fiscal year. So we
The
can be
books are
confident in
closed,
this.
Yep,
basically.
books are
Yeah.
closed.
Great,
That's all we need to know.
Books are closed and the audit's already started.
great. Okay, we'll move on to the review of the fiscal 21 reopening expenditures.
So overall, the reopening expenditures after grant reimbursement were $2,497,025. We did receive grant reimbursement of just shy of 1.1 million at 1,078,912. No real changes in the accounts that we've talked about previously, other than the slight excess balance again in the LPNs and the contracted cleaning that was canceled at the end of May.
Any questions? I do, for the committee to decide, we either, we need to look at the reopening this year, the August expenditures in the September. We can hold off until our October meeting. We can call another meeting this September. I need to know how the committee would like to do that, and I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. So either in October, we can review up until that point, which is fairly typical before we went to these monthly meetings, or if you'd like, I will schedule a meeting for September to do that.
So in October, we would review the monthly reporting for fiscal year 22.
Up until that point.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
as
think-
long as everyone's comfortable knowing that they'll have ever since the book's opened this year, they'll have a few months to look at.
So of 3 months.
Yeah, which is typical on how this committee used to work.
So we-
So,
Yeah, so we have for the next meeting, sorry.
Can I just comment? Sorry. Tara,
sorry, Mr. Sini?
Sorry.
I, in an email string that went around among board members, I thought we had a September 26th meeting scheduled for finance.
September,
Yes.
that's what I'm saying.
Yes.
That's what we want to do. We want to do a September 26th meeting. I'm trying to be cognizant because I know everyone's trying to go back to work. So if everyone's comfortable with that, I'll stay with that September 26th.
23rd.
Oh, sorry.
23rd, sorry.
Yeah,
My bad.
we're ready for that. Yep.
Okay,
Yeah, let's do that.
okay, perfect.
That's fine.
All right, I will now open it up to public comment.
Good morning. If you would like to speak during public comment, please click the participant's icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Next, click the raised hand option. The facilitator will identify you. Please state your name and address. You will have up to 3 minutes to comment. There are no raised hands at this time.
All right, thank you, everyone. With that, I'll call for a motion to adjourn. Mrs. Ritchie so moves, Mr. Sini seconds, all in favor. That is unanimous. Thank you, everyone, for your time this